You've always made everything about yourself. That was what my daughter-in-law said to me, not to my face, not even over the phone, but in a text message at 7 in the morning, 3 days after my hip replacement surgery. I was sitting in my recliner with my foot elevated on 2 folded pillows, a bowl of lukewarm oatmeal on the side table I hadn't touched. My son's name had lit up the screen, and I assumed it was him checking in, the way he'd promised he would when he drove me home from the hospital. I squinted through my reading glasses and read the message twice. It wasn't from my son. He had handed his phone to his wife. You've always made everything about yourself. Kyle is exhausted trying to manage your recovery from 3 hours away on top of everything we're dealing with. We need to know you're committed to the plan. If you're not, we need to give each other some space to process that. I set the phone down on the armrest. Outside, the dogwood tree in my front yard was just beginning to bloom, white petals catching the early April light. I had planted that tree the year my son was born. I watched it for a long moment and didn't move. The plan, as they'd been calling it for the better part of 6 months, was simple, in the way that only plans made by other people for your life can seem simple. My son and his wife wanted me to sell my house in Raleigh, relocate to Charlotte where they lived, and move into a smaller place nearby, close enough to help with their daughter Lily and the new baby they were expecting in July. It made sense on paper. I understood the logic. I even understood the need. What I had asked for, politely and once, was time. Not a refusal. Not a fight. Just a few months to recover from surgery and think clearly before making a decision that would rearrange the rest of my life. Apparently, that was making everything about myself. I had been a nurse for 31 years. I understood the body's timeline better than most. I knew what it meant to push through pain that hadn't finished teaching you something yet. I also knew that the week before my surgery, my son had sat at my kitchen table and said, "Mom, we just want what's best for you. No pressure. Just think about it." He'd helped himself to a second slice of the apple cake I'd baked and smiled at me like he meant it. 3 days after my surgery, his wife was sending messages about space and commitment before I'd even taken my first unassisted steps down the hallway. I didn't respond. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at the dogwood and breathed. The following week, when I could manage short distances with my walker, I drove the 3 hours to Charlotte, not out of guilt, not out of the old familiar fear that if I didn't show up, I would be forgotten. I went because I needed to see my granddaughter. Lily had just turned 6. She had my son's ears and her mother's laugh, and she had taken to calling me Grammy Dot, which I loved more than I had ever told anyone. My son answered the door. He looked tired in the way people look when they've been quietly unhappy for longer than they've admitted. He stepped aside to let me in and kissed me on the cheek without quite meeting my eyes. Lily was not downstairs. I asked about her, and he said she was napping, though it was 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday and Lily had not napped since she was 3. My daughter-in-law came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and greeted me with the particular smile people use when they want you to know they are being gracious under difficult circumstances. She offered me coffee. I said yes, because I needed something to do with my hands. We sat at their kitchen table and talked about nothing of substance for 20 minutes. The baby's room, a paint color they hadn't decided on yet. Traffic on the highway coming in. My son got up twice to refill his own coffee without refilling mine. My daughter-in-law mentioned twice that she was very tired. At no point did anyone bring Lily down. I drove home in the long, flat stretch of late afternoon, watching the highway unwind in front of me, and I thought about what my mother used to say when I was growing up. A closed door tells you more than any open one. She said it about people. She said it about situations. She had been dead for 12 years, and she was right again. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed in the dark and did what I'd been avoiding doing for the better part of 2 years. I thought clearly. My son was a good man. I believed that. But he was also a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that his mother would absorb discomfort so that he didn't have to. I had taught him that, probably. Not on purpose, but with consistency. Every time I'd stepped in without being asked, every time I'd swallowed the thing I actually wanted to say and offered something easier instead, every time I'd let a boundary dissolve, because the alternative felt like too large a price. I thought about the down payment. $42,000, 3 years ago, when they found the house in Charlotte they wanted and came up short. I had been planning to replace my car that year. Instead, I wrote a check. They thanked me over dinner, ordered a nice bottle of wine, and never mentioned it again. I thought about the wedding. My son had given me a budget of $4,000 for my contribution. I ended up spending closer to $9,000 because the florist they wanted cost more than planned, and my daughter-in-law cried when they showed me the quote and said she'd always dreamed of peonies. I was not a woman who could watch someone cry over peonies and say no. I thought about the year Lily was born, when my daughter-in-law had a difficult recovery and I took 3 weeks of leave from the hospital to stay with them. I slept on the pull-out sofa in the office. I woke up at night for the feedings so my son could sleep before work. I cooked every meal, did every load of laundry, sat in the rocking chair until my back ached in ways it still occasionally remembered. They told people I was a lifesaver. Then they went back to their lives and I went back to mine. And 6 months later, when I mentioned I might come visit for Lily's first Thanksgiving, my daughter-in-law said, "Actually, we were thinking of just keeping it small this year." I lay in the dark and counted. Not to build a case, not to nurse resentment, but because I had spent a long time telling myself that keeping track made you bitter. I was beginning to understand that not keeping track made you invisible. In the morning, I called my attorney. Her name was Patricia, and she had handled my will and my late husband's estate, and she spoke to me without condescension, which I had come to understand was rarer than it should be. I told her I needed to update some documents. "Can you come in Thursday?" she asked. I said yes. Between then and Thursday, I did 3 things. I went through the filing cabinet in my home office, the one with the deep bottom drawer where I kept financial records. I found the original wire transfer confirmation from the down payment. I found the receipts from the wedding expenses. I found the record of the monthly transfer I had been sending my son's household for the past year and a half, $300 a month, which had started as help covering Lily's preschool tuition and had quietly continued past the point when Lily started kindergarten. I had never asked why they still needed it. I had never asked about much. The second thing I did was call my bank. I spoke with a woman in customer service who processed my request to cancel the recurring monthly transfer. She read back the details in a flat, professional voice and asked if I'd like a confirmation email. I said yes, please. When I hung up the phone, I sat still for a moment and noticed that the silence felt different than it usually did. Less like absence, more like room. The third thing I did was water my garden. I had a small raised bed along the back fence where I grew tomatoes and herbs each summer, and I had been neglecting it since before the surgery. I pulled on my gardening gloves and moved slowly but deliberately, and the sun was warm on my shoulders, and nobody needed anything from me for the entire 40 minutes I was outside. Patricia's office was downtown, on the 4th floor of a building with a view of the city I had always found unexpectedly calming. She greeted me herself at the reception desk, which she only did for clients she'd known a long time. We sat in her office with coffee she'd made herself, not the powdery waiting room kind, and I told her what I needed. "I want to remove my son as the primary beneficiary of my estate," I said. "I'd like to create a trust for my granddaughter Lily, with a separate allocation for her sibling when the baby arrives. The remainder I'd like to go to my sister." Patricia didn't react the way people sometimes do when I say things that surprise them. She just nodded once, the way a person does when they've heard enough human stories to understand that the ones that hurt the most are often the most straightforward. "Is there a specific reason you want a trust for Lily rather than leaving it directly?" she asked. "Because I want her to have it when she needs it," I said, Not when her parents decide she does. Patricia wrote something on her notepad. That's wise. We went through the documents methodically. I had her draw up a revocation of the general power of attorney I had granted my son 2 years ago when I'd had a minor cardiac scare, and he had suggested it for peace of mind. I had given it to him because I trusted him. I still trusted him, in the way you can still trust someone, and also understand clearly that trust alone is not sufficient reason to hand someone the keys to your life. When I left Patricia's office, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly. More like a kind of stillness, the way the air gets before a storm passes, rather than before one arrives. My neighbor came by that evening. Her name was Ruth, and she had lived 2 houses down from me for 19 years. She brought a container of the chicken soup she made every April, a habit she'd started when her husband was ill and had simply never stopped. She didn't call ahead. She just knocked, which was her way, and I let her in. And we sat at my kitchen table the way we had sat at kitchen tables together for nearly 2 decades. She didn't ask me what was wrong. She poured herself a glass of water and looked at me with the directness of someone who had earned the right to see you clearly. "You want to tell me?" she said. I told her. All of it. The surgery, the text message, the visit where Lily never came downstairs, the down payment, the wedding, the 3 weeks on the pull-out sofa, the monthly transfer that had kept going for a year past its purpose. The attorney's office that morning. Ruth listened the way good listeners do, without making sounds to show she was following along, without nodding at regular intervals to prove she cared. She just sat there and received it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know what I've noticed?" she finally said. "You've been apologizing your way through that family for years." Not out loud. "Just in all the ways you keep showing up with your hands full." I looked at the table. I kept thinking, if I gave enough, it would mean something, I said. "It did mean something," Ruth said. "It just didn't mean what you thought it did." She stayed until 8. We talked about other things too, her daughter's garden in Oregon, a book we'd both been reading, the new bakery that had opened on the corner, and whether the croissants were actually as good as people claimed. When she left, the house felt quieter than before she arrived, but not in the lonely way, in the settled way. The call from my son came 2 days later. A Thursday, mid-afternoon. His voice was careful in a way that meant he had practiced. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to check in. How's the hip?" "The hip's fine," I said. "Thank you." A pause. "Good. Good. That's yeah." Another pause. "So, I got a notification from the bank about the transfer." I waited. "It said it was canceled." I figured it was some kind of processing error. "It wasn't an error," I said. Silence. "I stopped the transfer," I said. "I also made some changes to my will and revoked the power of attorney." "You'll receive the formal notification from my attorney?" I could hear him breathing. When he spoke, his voice had changed, flatter, less rehearsed. "Mom, why would you do that?" "Because your wife told me I make everything about myself," I said. "And I've decided she's right. From now on, I'm going to make more things about myself." That's not what he started. "She also made sure I couldn't see Lily when I drove 3 hours to visit," I said. "I just had surgery. I was using a walker. I sat at your kitchen table and drank half a cup of coffee and drove home." He didn't say anything. "I want you to understand that I'm not doing this to punish you," I continued. "I'm doing this because I've been handing you pieces of my life for a long time and telling myself it was love. Some of it was love. Some of it was fear. I'm trying to sort out which is which. And I can't do that while everything stays exactly as it's been." "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked slightly at the end of the word, just enough that I felt it in my chest. This feels really extreme. Your wife changed what I had access to," I said quietly. "I changed what she has access to. That seems fair to me." He was silent for a long moment. This is about the text message, I said. This is about Lily. This is about 30 years of me saying yes when I should have sometimes said not yet. The plan is a separate conversation, and I'd like to have it when we're both ready to have it honestly. He said he needed some time to think. I said I understood completely. We hung up. I made tea and stood at the kitchen window and watched the dogwood move in the light wind. My hip ached in the dull, improving way that meant it was healing correctly. I thought about Lily. I thought about the baby who wasn't born yet and who had done nothing wrong and who I already loved in the quiet, certain way you love someone you're prepared to be patient for. A week went by. Then another. My son did not call. My daughter-in-law did not call. There was one text from her. 2 days after my conversation with my son. I don't know what you've told him, but you've created a lot of stress in this household. I hope that feels worth it to you. I read it once. Then I put the phone in the kitchen drawer for the rest of the... My sister called that Friday. She lived in Savannah, and she called every Friday without fail, had done since our mother passed, which was the kind of consistency I had come to understand was not common and was not small. I told her what had happened, more briefly than I'd told Ruth, because my sister had a way of getting the full picture from the outline. Come down, she said when I finished. I'm still in physical therapy. Come down after physical therapy. Come for a week. I have the room. You can sleep until you feel like a person again. I had been putting off visiting her for 2 years. There was always a reason. My son's family needed me to be available. The holidays were coming. It wasn't a good time. I had made myself so perpetually available to people who didn't notice my availability that I had run out of availability for people who would have welcomed it. I booked a train ticket that night. The morning before I left, I stood in my living room and looked around at the life I had built in this house. 32 years in these rooms. My husband and I had chosen the paint colors together. The warm cream in the hallway. The deep blue in the bedroom that he said made him feel like he was sleeping inside the sky. After he died, I had kept everything the way he left it for nearly 3 years before I finally, gently, changed one wall in the kitchen to a soft green. Even that had felt like a negotiation. I took the framed photo off the mantel, the one of my son at his wedding, reaching back to take my hand as we walked down the aisle together, both of us laughing at something I no longer remembered. I held it for a moment. I didn't put it face down the way someone might in anger. I just moved it to the bookshelf in the hallway, where it was still visible but where I didn't have to see it first thing every morning. Then I packed my bag and called a cab and went to the station. My sister was at the platform with a hat that was too large for the overcast day and an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I could immediately remember. Pure, uncomplicated gladness. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything, and I stood there and let myself be held. Her house was old and warm and smelled like the magnolia that grew against the back fence. She had a spare room with a quilt our grandmother had made and a window that looked out over the garden, and she had put fresh flowers on the nightstand without making a production of it. We sat on the porch that first evening with sweet tea and talked until the sky went dark and the fireflies came up out of the grass. She let me say what I needed to say without steering me toward a conclusion. That was her particular gift. She understood that sometimes people didn't need advice. They needed somewhere to put the weight down. Is there any part of you that wants to call him? She asked at one point. I thought about it honestly. Yes, I said, but I want to call the version of him who sat at my kitchen table and said, no pressure, just think about it. I'm not sure that's the version I'd reach. She nodded. You always knew him better than you let yourself admit. I think I knew, and I kept hoping I was wrong, I said. We were quiet for a moment. What about Lily? She asked. I'll find my way back to Lily, I said. That's a different road. She nodded again. Don't let them use her as a bargaining chip. I won't, I said. Not anymore. I stayed for 10 days. I slept without the particular tightness I'd carried in my chest for months. I walked slowly along the waterfront in the mornings, my hips strengthening a little more each day. I read 2 novels I'd been meaning to get to for a year. I had dinner with my sister's neighbor, a woman my age who had retired from teaching and who had the particular dry humor of someone who had spent 30 years in middle school and emerged with her sanity intact. We laughed until 10 o'clock, and I drove back to my sister's house feeling lighter than I had in a year. On the 8th day, a voicemail came in from a number I recognized as my son's home phone rather than his cell. When I played it, it was Lily's voice. Grammy Dot. It's me. I lost another tooth, and the tooth fairy came, and I got $2, and I want to call you, but Mommy said you're on a trip. I hope your hip doesn't hurt anymore. Can you call me back? I miss your tomatoes. I love you. I played it 3 times. Then I sat on my sister's porch in the afternoon light, and I wrote back a text to my son's number, not to my daughter-in-law, to my son, and I said, "Please tell Lily I called and that I miss her and that I'm saving the first tomato of the summer for her. Tell her my hip is much better. And tell her I love her too." He responded 20 minutes later. Just, "I will." It was the most honest communication we'd had in weeks. I came home to Raleigh on a Tuesday. The house felt like mine in a way it sometimes didn't after a trip, as if absence had reminded it of the relationship. I opened the windows and brewed a pot of coffee and sat in the good chair in the living room, not checking my phone, not planning anything, just being present in the quiet I had worked hard enough to deserve. Ruth came over that evening with the croissants from the new bakery on the corner. They were, as it turned out, exactly as good as people claimed. "You look different," she said. "Better or worse?" I asked. "Taller," she said. My physical therapist cleared me for full activity at the end of that month. I celebrated by spending an entire Saturday in the garden, planting tomatoes, trimming back the herbs, turning the soil in the raised bed with my hands the way I had always preferred to with gloves. My knees ached at the end of it. I didn't mind. My son called on a Sunday evening in late May. Not his wife. Him. He sounded tired. Not the tight-managed tired of someone who has rehearsed. The real kind. "Mom, can we talk? For real, this time." "Yes," I said. He talked for a long time. He talked about the pregnancy, how frightened he'd been, how much pressure he felt, how he'd let that fear make him into someone he didn't particularly like. He talked about the Charlotte plan and admitted that it had always been less about what was good for me and more about what was convenient for them. He talked about Lily, how she asked about me often, and how he hadn't known how to answer. He didn't talk about his wife, and I didn't ask. I listened to all of it. When he finished, I said, "I love you. I have always loved you. And I will not be available to you in the same way I've been available, because that arrangement was making me small in ways neither of us were noticing." He was quiet. "I want to know you. The real version, the one who's scared and tired and doesn't have it all figured out. I can be your mother for that person. I just can't keep being an emergency fund and a standing appointment who gets canceled when something more important comes up." He said, very quietly, that he understood. "I believe you," I said. The baby came in July. A boy. My son called me from the hospital, and I could hear the particular rawness in his voice that new fathers have, the rawness of realizing that love can make you afraid in ways you were completely unprepared for. I stayed on the phone with him for 40 minutes. I told him what to expect, what was normal, what the first weeks would ask of him. I was his mother, and I was a nurse, and I was the person who had rocked him through the frightening nights when he was small, and in that hour those things were all the same thing. I did not drive to Charlotte. Not yet. We were finding our way back to each other by degrees, and I had learned enough about myself to understand that showing up before I was truly welcomed would only rebuild the old pattern. I sent a gift. I sent a card with a message I'd written 3 times before I got it right. I sent my love. Lily came to visit me in August. My son drove her up on a Saturday morning and waited in his car in the driveway while she ran up the path to my front door with her backpack bouncing and her face blazing with excitement. He waved at me from the car, a small, effortful wave, and I waved back. Then he drove away, and Lily and I had the weekend entirely to ourselves. We picked the tomatoes. We made sauce from scratch, and she stood on the step stool at the counter and stirred with a wooden spoon that was too big for her and got tomato on her shirt within 4 minutes. We read 2 books on the couch after dinner, and she fell asleep leaning against my shoulder in the old way, heavy and trusting. And I sat very still so as not to wake her and listened to the house breathe around us. Before she went to sleep in the guest room, she handed me a drawing she'd been making in the car on the way up. 2 figures standing in a garden. One tall and one small, with a red circle between them, a tomato. I understood, and above it, in careful first-grade letters, me and Grammy Dot's house. I put it on the refrigerator next to the postcard my sister had sent from Savannah. I turned off the kitchen light. I had not fixed everything. I didn't expect to. My son and I were in the careful early stages of learning how to know each other honestly, which was slower work than pretending, but more durable. My daughter-in-law and I existed in a polite distance that might someday become something warmer, or might not. I had stopped deciding that outcome was my responsibility to manage. What I had done, and what had taken me 64 years to do, was understand the difference between love and the performance of love, between giving from abundance and giving from fear, between saying yes because you want to and saying yes because you've forgotten that no is a complete sentence. I had updated my will. Lily and her brother each had a trust, not large, but real and protected, and theirs when the time came. The rest went to my sister, not because I wanted to punish my son, but because I had watched money go into a household where it was spent without gratitude. And I had decided that the things I had spent my working life building deserved better stewardship than that. I sat on my porch in the September evening with a glass of wine and the particular feeling of a life that was finally pointed in the right direction. Not perfect, not easy, but honest in a way it hadn't been in a long time. The dogwood in the front yard had finished blooming months ago. In the fall, it would turn a deep, tired red before it let its leaves go. I looked at it the way you look at something you planted in one life and are still tending in another. My phone buzzed on the armrest. A text from my sister. Thinking of you. Tonight. Are you all right? I typed back. More than all right. She replied with a heart. I put the phone face down, not away, just quiet, and I watched the evening settle over the yard that was mine, the air that was mine, the slow and unhurried time that was, for the first time in longer than I could measure, mine. If any part of this has touched something in you, I want you to hear this. It is not too late to take up the space you were always meant to take. It is not selfish to ask for what you gave freely for years. And it is not the end of love to say finally and clearly that love has to go both ways. Leave a comment if you've been there, and follow along because there are more stories like this one, the quiet ones, the ones we don't always say out loud.